Hi, welcome back again. Today I'll be reading another no sleep story posted by user Christian Wallace titled, I'm an Arctic explorer and I found an abandoned toy workshop. When did they arrive? Maggie appeared through the blizzard like a ghost, her footsteps and profile having been hidden by the sheets of snow and ice falling all around us. I didn't jump, and once I realized she was looking at the cigarette in my hand, I merely nodded and offered her one. She surprised me by taking it, and we stood quietly, eyes fixed on the spot on the horizon where we knew the ship was lying perfectly preserved. I had HQ send a drone over with more appropriate supplies, I said. So we're definitely staying then? Sebastian must be beside himself, Maggie replied, following it up with a quiet chuckle. He's certainly looking itchy, I replied. But personally, I'd be fine never looking at another piece of suet in the eye. Utter torture, she groaned, shaking her head. I've been jogging 10 miles every morning since I was 17, but these last few days have been something else. He just thrives off it, though, doesn't he? It's his stick, I think that's what it says, I replied. Well, he does. He only agreed because he thought we'd never find the damn thing, and it'd be 2 weeks of solid trekking through Arctic winter. But he's had his own fundraising to do, and he needs to work up the interest with littler treks like this one. 5,000 calories a day, Maggie said. I don't know how anyone could do it for fun. Well, at least the new supplies are better suited to camp life. Plus, I gestured with the cigarette in my hand as it burned down to the final few embers. We can slip in a few amenities now, don't we? Now we don't have to haul every last pound behind us. Maggie took a final draw and handed me the butt when she was done. I had an empty can of Coke I was using to keep them in, personally unwilling to throw them willy-nilly onto the ground. The ice is safe, she told me, dropping a bomb like it was nothing. In fact, it's a few miles thick. We've just got the full satellite data through, and, well, it's quite intriguing. Why is that? I asked. It's not alone. There's something else a day's hike north. Hard, hollow, and big. I wanted to do a double check before I told you. It's certainly a very odd finding. Well, we've got the ship to explore for now, I said. If Sebastian feels like it, he can burn off some of the calories checking out the second signal. I watched Maggie disappear back into the gray wind before returning to my own tent. Sitting down on my coat, I contemplated the news she'd just delivered. My eyes drifted to the horizon again and again, as I turned the words over and over in my mind. The ship was safe to board. The ship I'd spent years writing about, publishing papers on, researching. Hell, there was a scaled model of the damn thing in my living room I'd made by hand as a young postdoc. The Pinafore was lost with all hands during a barely discussed attempt at finding the Northwest Passage. Standing at 80 feet long, it was a caravel, and thus one of the first European ships capable of oceanic crossings. I'd spent years postulating that it was still frozen in the ice, just like the infamous ghost ship, the HMS Terror, a comparison I'd happily played up after the success of the fictional novel and TV show based on the Lost Franklin expedition. One wealthy benefactor later, and I was equipped with more money than my whole department had seen in years, along with the testy, but experienced guide, Sebastian. And somehow, against all odds, we found it after a brutal 7-day hike. Ever since I'd first spotted the mast from miles away, I'd been vibrating with barely contained excitement. Knowing it was out there, just waiting, well, I had no hope of getting to sleep. I stood up from my cot and grabbed a torch, but kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark as I checked camp for any signals of life. Certain that I was alone, I began my walk. It wasn't a long way to go. We'd camped a few hundred meters away to keep clear in case the ship was at risk of cracking the ice. Unlikely as that was. Still, it was dark and I got turned pretty bad after a few minutes. Even with my torch, I started to feel the first twinges of panic. But I kept at it until, after 20 minutes of nervous fumbling, I finally saw the mast once more. It was barely a glimpse shape in the dark, a patch of white overhead that caught my torch and made me jump. Lowering the light Lowering the light brought the rest of the ship into view, and for a split second I was dumbstruck with awe. The ship was close enough to nearly touch, and while I've seen bigger ships before and since, something about it just made me feel breathtakingly small. It was as if the groaning of the ice beneath my feet belonged to the ship, and not the weather, like it was some great nautical beast crying out to me. The ship had left shore in 1543 and never returned, and yet the word Pinafore was still written along its side, engraved in gorgeous detail on a plinth as long as I am tall. And right there, just a few feet away, was a ladder that enabled entry. I tried the wood and could have cried when I found it held my weight. I got 2 rungs up before I fell backward and bloodied my lip on the hull. I didn't let it stop me, even as the weather threatened to freeze me to the spot. I clumsily forced my way overboard and collapsed onto the deck, shouting my laughter into the blizzard. No one would be able to hear me anyway. The ship was like a black volcanic rock, encased in glittering ice. Here and the bits of ridging and wood jutted out, so cold I'd imagine it would tear my skin right off my hand if I touched it. I marveled at the sight of it all and made a slow, deliberate circle of the deck, letting out a tremendous laugh of joy when I saw the helm was still intact, wheel and all. I thought I would stop there, but as the minutes ticked on, it wasn't enough. And when my foot caught the trapdoor leading to below deck, I found my hands moving towards the latch before I'd had a single conscious thought. It wasn't easy to open, taking maybe an hour or 2, but all things considered, it wasn't as hard as it ought to have been. And when the door finally slammed open, landing on the deck with a terrible thunderclap, it revealed a set of steps descending into total darkness. At the sight of it, I felt a small catch form at the back of my throat. The rigging of this ship had been snapped, the beams and masts broken and gouged, the wood splintered. I was walking into a tomb. The Arctic is an alien place, the geography profoundly different to what we're used to. Great obelisks of glistening white rock rise meters into the air. Walls of snow lie ready to collapse, and a landscape rendered in pure blank white appears to the human eye as a faint abstract, almost surreal. The ground is not solid rock, but floating ice, and below it lies one of the most hostile and unknown oceans in the world, an ocean that is forever cut off from sunlight. I took one last look around the starlit deck and descended into the ship, the roaring wind fading into a whistle as I ducked below. The stairs led to a small hold, with a single corridor that carried on to the fore of the ship, where I knew I'd find the captain's quarters. My intention was to head right there and ignore the little things along the way. Except what lay in wait for me in the hold was no little thing. I screamed when I first saw the head. It was a gaunt, eyeless, leathery thing, twisted into a frozen grin of pain. A gnarled hand reached out towards me, and I let out another shriek and fell backwards, sending the torch spinning out where it finally settled on the monstrosity before me. The scream died as I realized slowly that the thing was not moving. It was not a single thing. A dozen heads lay cramped together, arms and fingerless hands shoved out in awkward angles, as if they were desperately groping for something that lay just out of reach. It was a pile of bodies, their limbs and torsos interwoven in a bone-breaking display of torture and mutilation. I let the mortal terror drain away, but I lost all desire to stay for a moment longer. I grabbed the torch with quivering hands and turned back towards the way I came. That was when the hatch slammed shut, and I found another scream of terror rising in my throat. "Couldn't have called me?" Craig said as I sat shivering under a foil blanket. I was clutching a small cup of hot chocolate, which Craig supplemented with a shot of brandy when no one else was looking. I thanked him with an appreciative nod. "You know I would have given anything to be there with you," he added. Then you're as stupid as he is, Maggie said, stepping down onto the ice as Sebastian started to follow her. If I hadn't wanted another cigarette, I would never have realized you were missing. You'd have been trapped in there all night with that thing. Craig looked at Maggie as she gave a nod. Holy shit, he said. I've gotta go look. Let him, I said as Maggie went to stop him. She rolled her eyes but let him go, and Craig rushed off, catching Sebastian just as he took the final step down from the ship. This could have gone so much worse, she said, expecting no reply. I imagined that would have been the end of the matter, and I looked up eagerly when Sebastian slided up to join the conversation. I owe you a bit of an apology there, David, he said, looking a little too pale around the edges. When I heard you screaming, I thought it had just been the hatch slamming shut and you were just scared. But Jesus, that is... No one wants to be locked in the dark with that thing. What the hell is it? The crew? I suggested. Shame we didn't bring any biologist with us. Your toys can help with that, right? Sebastian said. You've got drones coming and going so often we could set up a department store. We can take samples in return. Maybe set up a video feed? Maggie replied. As a meteorologist, I definitely feel a little out of my wheelhouse. What about you? She asked me the last part, and I tried to think of whether anything I'd ever encountered came close to what I saw in the hold of that ship. When nothing came to mind, I shook my head. One fucked up Christmas tree, Sebastian said with a dark laugh, and I felt a shiver run down my back at his words. It really had resembled some kind of tree, and when I filed the thought away in my head, hoping it wouldn't pop back up the next time I put my own tree up in my living room. Hey, he cried. Maybe you can hook up the drones to it and just fly the whole thing back to town. Sebastian really didn't like the drones. If he'd had his own way, he would have had his dogs doing the expedition with dogs and silver boots just like his ancestors. That reminds me, I said. Maggie's got something to show you. I think you might like it. We were told the worst thing to do was touch or move it, so we didn't. The mountain of frozen flesh and withered bone was obscured from view with some makeshift curtains Craig threw together, and we carried on working like it wasn't there. Craig and Maggie took photos and made an inventory of every object we could find, carefully labeling and categorizing each tong and blade for later expeditions. I tried to pore through these items to find something that might give a clue to the ship's final fate. A dozen or so men crewed the ship in its prime, including a surgeon, a cook, a smith, and a cartographer. We found faded broken letters that spoke of mothers and wives, small figures sculpted from whalebone, and ancient bottles of homebrewed spirits stashed away under pillows. The ship's surgeon and resident scholar even had quite the collection of shells that he'd carefully labeled. Here and there were also found a patch of floor stained suspiciously in the dark, or a blade embedded in a door wall, but we tried to ignore the implication of violence. The captain's quarters were, well, they were really odd. I concluded that the ship had disappeared close to Christmas given the sprig of holly affixed to the ceiling, a small concession the captain had made to the season, but the desk was smashed in two. Rope and twine lay all around the floor, and drag marks were visible along the wood, along with a few scattered fingernails. There was also a discarded musket under the desk, along with a solitary, half-gnawed human finger that lay close by. In the doctor's quarters, I saw that the cabinets were bare of the usual oils and tinctures employed at the time, useless as they would have been, though his diary spoke of nothing spreading amongst the crew. There was a lifetime of work, and the details we captured guaranteed more funding than I could have ever imagined. We had our ghost ship, we had our thrilling and creepy details, and we had one of the great big, inexplicable piles of corpses that would boggle some of the greatest researchers in the university. It was a little scary, but otherwise it was good news. Sebastian had departed the day before and checked in regularly for the first 12 hours or so. After that, he went silent, which we put down to which we put down to the poor weather or his general single-mindedness. At the 24-hour mark, Maggie became a little itchy, and when she pointed out the silence to Craig and I, we found ourselves sharing her concern. We decided to try calling him on the radio and waited silently for his reply. What came was a discordant series of clicks and heavy breathing. "Sebastian?" Maggie asked. "Are you okay?" But there was only the strangest hiss of the radio, broken by the occasional breath or scrape. "Sebastian," she cried, "please respond." We tried for hours until, eventually, his radio stopped returning any signal. Craig figured it may have died, or maybe Sebastian had turned it off and started ignoring us. But something about the strange noises had left us all feeling a little nervous. Maggie suggested that he'd just activated the radio by accident, and we were hearing the sounds of his walking, but the breathing felt close and ragged, almost animalistic, like a man approaching death. Still, it was the best theory we had, and we agreed to wait a little longer. The following 12 hours were tense. Eventually, we stopped working and returned to the camp, where we tried to contact Sebastian with a more powerful radio and updated HQ to let them know. The ship that trailed us along the coast sent a few drones over the area Sebastian was meant to be, and reported no visible signs of the man. No big surprise there. We figured, given just how hard it'd be to find anything in the tundra. But the pit in my stomach grew heavier with each hour that passed without us hearing back from our guide. After 48 hours, it was decided we'd have to go look for Sebastian ourselves. We were moderately experienced in hiking, and the spot shouldn't have been more than a 6-hour ride away. It was Sebastian who had insisted on making the journey by foot, always eager to push himself to the limit, and the chances were it had led him to some kind of misfortune. "Is that a door?" Craig asked. "I think it is," I answered. Maggie was on her hands and knees, staring at the door that was no taller than my waist and embedded in a snow banking. I reached out and rubbed away the ice and snow around the doorframe, revealing a wall made of crudely stacked slabs of wood as thick as my torso. "Who the fuck put a door here?" he asked. "It goes deeper," Maggie replied, hands cupped around her face as she peered through a small window set into the door. "I think I can see stairs going down." "Are we sure Sebastian was here?" I asked. "Almost definitely," Maggie answered, holding up a small shred of blue fabric that had been jammed into the doorframe. It was the unmistakable baby blue of Sebastian's windbreaker. "He's not the only one," Craig said, reaching into the snow to pull out a wooden knife bearing the Pinafore's seal. "Looks like our ancient explorers came this way as well, and I don't think it ended well." I took the knife and noticed a faint trim of rust brown red splattered along the edge. "We'll have to mark our path for the future," I said, "and GPS tag this whole area for full excavation at a later date." Maggie nodded and took the knife to add it into our inventory while Craig and I worked on opening the door. It took a little effort, but quickly popped open and swung inwards with a spine-tickling squeak. The building had a roof so low we had to duck. The beams above us were rough-hewn trunks with still visible bark preserved by God knows how long spent in the Arctic tundra. It was like a makeshift cabin, the kind of thing you'd find in the Canadian or Nordic wilderness. It had the sturdy appearance of Viking construction, and Maggie noted a few strange runes stitched into the inner doorway that I couldn't translate or properly recognize, but they seemed faintly familiar nonetheless. The room itself was a good 20 by 20 meters, with a workshop that ran along 3 of the walls. Maggie shuffled over and picked up one of the stools that was tucked neatly under the countertop. Holding it up, she showed it to be no bigger than my forearm. "What the fuck?" she muttered. "Is this a fucking joke?" Craig cried, calling our attention to a small wooden object he held in his hands. It was a hedgehog, or a carving of one, with little wheels instead of legs so it could be rolled along the ground. "It could be some kind of fetish," I mumbled, swallowing a knot of anxiety in my throat. "It's a fucking toy," Craig cried, laughing at the ridiculousness. "Is this some kind of prank, Dave? Is this some fucked up PR stunt by the university? Because if it is, I'm not going to be happy." "I don't know what this is," I said, "but I'm not in on it. And if any of you are, I'd appreciate you saying now." "Sebastian, maybe?" Maggie said, a quiver entering her voice. She was holding up one of his shoes, the fabric half torn and the insides splashed with still wet blood. Maybe this is all his doing. He was assigned to us by the university. I knocked a fist against the wall and realized I could shatter my hands against that wood and not put so much as a dent in it. Seems elaborate for a prank, I said. We should work on the assumptions that Sebastian needs our help, and if this is a joke, we can kick his ass afterwards. Amen, Maggie replied, and together we walked towards the nearby stairs. Footprints were visible in the thin layer of snow that had drifted into the building over the years, and we knew that if Sebastian was near, then he must be somewhere below. I haven't seen this before, Craig said, this kind of material. He was holding a toy horse, crudely put together out of basic cylinders and squares. The material that covered it was a velvety sort of leather that was strangely soft despite the ice-cold temperature. He turned it over in his hand, and we both noticed a faded patch of blue. I watched him squint at it for a few moments and reached out and gestured for him to put it down. What is it? He asked, ignoring my suggestion. It's Erasmus, I said, my voice a little hoarse. The patron saint of sailors. You should put that thing down. Why would someone paint that onto a toy? They wouldn't, I replied, but they would almost certainly have tattooed it onto the arm of a 16th century sailor. His eyes went wide and he dropped the toy with a disgusted cry. Fucking hell, he cried. That's not all, Maggie said. I think this is bone, she said as she held up a carving of the baby Jesus no larger than my thumb, made out of a yellowing ivory. Any guesses as to where it may have come from? Many Arctic cultures make carvings out of seal bone, I suggested. How many of them make fucking toys in a workshop built for hobbits? Craig cried. Am I the only one who wants to pin the tail on the donkey and make the connection here? Do you have any ideas? Maggie asked, looking over towards me. I shook my head. Maybe an old European colony, I said. Someone came out here to try and, I don't know, some religious fanatics, maybe? Someone who wanted to recreate the myth? Out of human skin? Craig asked. And where the fuck is Sebastian? The floor we were on was a lot busier than the last, crammed full of desks and tools used for woodworking and carving, many of which lay strewn about the floor. Somewhere below us, the walls must have collapsed, and that was where the ice was coming from, as the snow that covered the floor was noticeably thicker than the one above. We found no obvious signs of Sebastian, except some signs of disturbance among the snow that led, once again, to another set of stairs descending into the darkness. That bodes poorly, Craig muttered. Sebastian's ice pick was embedded into the floor up to the hilt. A few strands of hair were still threaded around the blade, along with some coils of rope identical to the kind of the pinafore. As does that, Maggie said, gesturing to the Christmas tree. Not only had the toys in this part of the building grown more demented, depicting men with huge phalluses and women tearing their breasts open to reveal ribs and lungs and hearts, but an ancient withered tree stood dominating the center of the room. Its limbs were decorated with black prunes and charcoal rope that would have been familiar to anyone who's seen what centuries of decay can do to frozen human remains. The baubles were organs, the tinsel intestines, left out to freeze dry over centuries of exposure. One of the baubles, however, was fresh, making red velvet slush of the ice below. What is it? Craig asked. I think it's a kidney, I said. Steam was rising from the dripping piece of offal that sagged from the tree branch. It's still warm, too. The eyes on the doll, Craig said, swallowing nervously in the cold. Do they look familiar to you? I turned to the toy he was staring at, its haunted face lit up by the intense beam of his torch. Its expression was remarkably well carved, seeming almost lifelike, were it not for the obvious coloration of hardwood. The eyes, however, were far too human, and the irises of a crystal blue that was indeed quite familiar. Unable to ignore his curiosity, Craig reached out and gently poked the glassy orbs. Only they weren't glassy. They were soft, and Craig's finger came away with a faint trickle a vicious fluid that lingered in his skin. "They're still warm too," he gagged. "Oh God, they're his. They have to be." We did eventually find Sebastian. He was alive in a sense, although only on his very last breath. He had been cracked open like a turkey and left to air out in the freezing cold. His skin and bones pulled apart with expert precision. His face a pallid mask of terror. He was conscious, but could only wail and cry, blinded and terrified. He initially tore his hand away when Maggie reached out and took it. He was naked, seconds away from freezing to death, and Craig almost draped his coat over him instinctively, but stopped at the realization it would be resting directly on top of his exposed chest cavity. He was alive for no more than a minute as we crouched there. He did not speak, no matter how often we asked our desperate and frightened questions. The only sense we got out of what was going on, though, was the relief that passed over his face when he finally died. As if he'd awoken from a last terrible nightmare and was free of the terror. "I thought old Nick was a saint," Craig said, wiping the snot and tears from his face after we'd all had a good cry. "If this isn't his workshop, it's a pretty fucked up place." "Could be some lunatic who settled up here," Maggie said. "Some serial killer with a demented Christmas fixation." "Doesn't explain the sailors," I replied. "The knife by the door, the tree, the toys, so clearly made out of the remains. How could that be a serial killer?" "So what are we saying exactly?" Craig said. "Santa's elves went off the straight and narrow? Is that it? What the fuck does any of this even mean?" "Does it matter?" Maggie replied. "We need to get Sebastian back to base camp, and then we need to get out of here, ASAP." "Sebastian might not be an option," I said, looking over the still steaming remains of his corpse. "I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend another second longer in this place. And as awful as it might seem, we have to weigh up our responsibilities to the dead against our responsibilities to the living." "You mean us?" Maggie said. "Yes," I nodded. "I mean us. We won't be helping him by hauling him up 4 floors and across 15 miles of open Arctic tundra. But we can at least make our lives a little easier by getting on with it and calling in as help as soon as possible." "What are we going to tell them?" Craig asked. "We'll figure it out," I replied. We returned to camp a few hours later, taking a few of the less terrifying artifacts for testing. The ride back was silent and eerie affair, and Craig mentioned more than once he was thankful it was still light. We managed with some effort to get back just as the sun was setting, watching the approaching night cast a dreary gloom across the magnificent tundra. I found myself agreeing with him. All of us wanted to be somewhere safe, somewhere secure, and the thin tents of our camp offered little enough protection against the elements, let alone whatever else may lie beyond, but they were the best that we had. As if to emphasize this point, when I arrived, I noticed them flapping in the wind, and dreaded the night I'd spend there. "How long till the second team arrive?" Maggie asked. "A few days," Craig replied. "We could ride out ourselves using the snowmobiles, but I don't fancy my chances without Sebastian. Not to mention," he left his words hanging in the air. I knew what he wanted to say. "Not to mention whatever else may be out there." "It's going to be a long wait," Maggie said. "It is," I replied. We all spent the night in the same tent, listening to the storm pick up until it felt like we were an island alone in the endless dark. At one point, we were woken up to the sound of something outside, and we waited carefully until it stopped. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but it must have been late. I couldn't have slept more than a few hours before Maggie was shaking me awake to the blinding light. "David," she cried. "Craig's gone. He's gone. I can't find him anywhere." I threw myself out of my sleeping bag and crawled out of the tent. In one swift movement, I took in the destroyed equipment and torn open tents. Something had come sniffling through our camp, and it hadn't stopped looking until it found what it wanted. "Do you think it was a bear?" Maggie cried. "With the ice shelf melting, they're coming farther and farther inland every year, and there have been more than a few." She stopped when she saw me bend over and pick something up. I held it up for both of us to see. A piece of rope, made of rough hewn twine, unlike anything we'd brought with us. It was an exact copy of the kind I'd found lying around the pinafore and the floor of the workshop, except this one was stained with a bright red patch of blood. "Fuck," she whispered. "Where do you think he went?" The storm had cleared up and the morning air was so crisp we could see the mast of the pinafore all the way from camp. "You don't think—" "I do," I said. "Look, the snow is disturbed along the path. Maybe if he was lost or confused and got lost, he might have relied on the markers we left to find his way to the ship. You know Craig would say right now, don't you?" Maggie asked. "He'd say that's bullshit." Let's hope he'd be wrong. We were halfway there when we found the box. It had been gift-wrapped and left alone in the middle of our path. Its top clear of snow, small footprints the size of a child's led away from it and back to the pinafore. "This is too weird," Maggie said. I bent down and noticed the name tag etched into the meticulous cursive. "Welcome, Genuines," I read. "Welcome, friends." "Welcome, old friends," I said, doing my best to translate. "It's Old English." I pulled on the twine that bound the plain brown paper around the box, and the whole package unwrapped with elaborate ease. Each face of the box fell down one by one, and Maggie let out a terrible cry. "Oh God!" She shrieked. "What the fuck?" It was Sebastian's head, his mouth stuffed with blood-sogged straw, while his hollow eyes glared at us with terrible pain. This video is getting quite long, so stay tuned for part 2.